Good morning and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday Zoom series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis. Today we are honored to host an expert on Eastern European and Russian history and politics. Richard Sakwa is a British political scientist and professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent, England. He is also a senior research fellow at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. While completing his doctorate on Moscow politics, he spent a year on a British Council scholarship at Moscow State University, and then worked for 2 years in Moscow in the Mir Science and Technology Publishing House. Before moving to Kent, he lectured at the University of Essex and also the University of California, Santa Cruz, which we're going to have to ask you about. He's written several books about Russia and Central and Eastern European communist and post-communist politics. He is the author of several books on the region, including Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War, Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlines, and his latest, which we will discuss today, The Lost Peace, how the West failed to prevent a second Cold War. The Lost Peace is a brilliant and exceptionally well-researched book, which I'm going to hold up and show you. And I highly recommend that all of you get this book. It has all the information you're not getting anywhere else but need to know, especially in relationship to the war in Ukraine. So we are very honored today to host you, Richard, and I want to welcome you to our program. And yes, we're very excited to have you.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. And he is live from Kent, England, correct?
Yes, indeed, in Canterbury. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to begin the questions with back to the end of the first Cold War. In the US, we were promised a peace dividend. Funds could be redirected from the military-industrial complex to social programs, education, and infrastructure. But these promises were all but abandoned as the US military budget mushroomed every year, and we became involved in more and more wars. Gorbachev was probably the only statesman, I think, who had a vision of the shared peace and prosperity that could follow the Cold War. So I'd like you first to tell us about the transformative potential of Gorbachev's vision, what it was, what it could have brought to the world, and second, why you think it was sabotaged.
Yeah, thanks very much. So we start with the easy ones. Yep. So the why the peace lost. The argument that I make is that we need to distinguish between the international system and the conduct of international politics. By the international system, I mean the United Nations system itself, established in 1945, the Charter, and the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but not just the international system as a type of institution, but also that vision in 1945 that after the world's worst war, the massive catastrophe, the loss of life, there was a sense amongst all the participants, we all know the phrase "never again," that we should avoid it. So the meta argument, the underlying vision of that 1945 system, the Charter system, the UN system, is the belief that a better world is possible, that there was a better way of organizing human affairs. So that I sort of categorize as the international system. Unfortunately, after 1945, we entered into the first Cold War, sadly, the first, because there's now a second, then in which we had the Soviet bloc on the one side, and we had the US-led bloc on the other side. When Gorbachev put an end to the Cold War in the late 1980s, I think that some of you will remember perestroika and all the excitement at that time. He did not appeal, or it was not a capitulation to the West, as Reagan and some successors put it with Star Wars, that they basically forced the Soviet Union into submission. It was the exact opposite. Yes, it was difficult. There were difficulties, but what Gorbachev did was appealed to that vision embedded in the UN system, in the international system, and indeed to the spirit of 1945, if I can put it back, or even more specifically, the spirit of the Elbe, when Soviet and US forces met on the River Elbe in April 1945. That's what he appealed to. And that was the vision, which has not died yet. I still think that this vision of an alternative and a better world is there. Unfortunately, the other lot, that is the US-led Cold War alliance, what I call the political West. Now, this political West is a child of the Cold War. It's you remember that communist Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell address talking condemned a military-industrial complex. Well, others, Michael Glennon has talked about the establishment of a Trumanite state versus the Madisonian one. The Madisonian is all that, the democratic elections and so on. Yet the Trumanite state endures from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson, obviously, and so on, all the way to the present day. That is how we got into this mess. We've got a political West that stubbornly refuses to go away. And can I just add one more thing? Within the West, and so that's why we've got this political West, but we're not talking about the West as a whole. I actually now begin to look at it in this way, that on the one side, we have an imperial West, US as empire, endless discussion about that. But there's also a better West, which I nowadays think of it in terms of a Commonwealth. You've got a Commonwealth of Massachusetts, obviously Virginia in the US, but a Commonwealth globally, that in this Commonwealth vision is that vision which was there in the United Nations system. So that's how we got into, how it failed, because that Commonwealth couldn't, as it were, withstand that military industrial complex. And of course, then we get into the detail of NATO enlargement and all the rest, which is just simply an emanation, a reflection of the failure to curb that power of the Cold War political West. So, when I say that, I'm comparing, if you like, a better West versus today's militarized political West. And, the mere fact that we're talking today is a sign that we are, if you like, you people are certainly part of that Commonwealth, part of that agenda, which is why you've got a commonality with Gorbachev and with all those peaceniks around the world.
Yes, it was very inspired when I read Perestroika back in the day when it was published. I want to go to something now that has caused a lot of disagreement in even the progressive community, and that is what was exactly said to Gorbachev by Secretary of State James Baker about NATO expansion. There's been this ongoing disagreement, and I have to say I have never seen it explained as well as I read it in your book. You use the exact quotes from Secretary of State Baker and Gorbachev, and that cleared it up in my mind on one level. However, it looked like a real devious sleight of hand maneuver by James Baker. So I would like you to explain exactly what took place between Baker and Gorbachev about not moving 1 inch east from Germany, the United Germany.
So there's two parts to this answer. So if I forget the second one, if you could remind me, the first part is exactly what happened. And indeed, what happened, this is at the time, the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989. And quite soon after that, the issue of German unification came on the agenda. Then the question was, what to do with Germany? Should all of Germany be demilitarized, become neutral, which is, of course, what the Soviet Union always wanted earlier? Stalin actually offered that earlier. He offered unification in exchange for neutrality. So that was the question. And this is when in February 1990, James Baker came over and asked Gorbachev this question: would you prefer a united Germany outside of NATO and then, as it were, a loose cannon, or would you prefer it inside and controlled and constrained by all the norms of NATO? And it was a question. And then, of course, he did, and loads of people then said the US was careful in what it was saying, but obviously then, of course, Mrs. Thatcher and so on said it would not expand. And the agreement was ultimately Germany could join NATO as a united thing, but it wouldn't go beyond that. But the US later on, and this is where the second leg comes in, and that is the Treaty on German Unification in June 1990, did not have this provision that it wouldn't go beyond Germany. So the signal, the fact that NATO did enlarge to encompass the old GDR, was a signal, okay, if we can do it for that, we can keep going. And of course, they've kept going to where we are today. And so, yeah, it was a sleight of hand, and basically Gorbachev was conned. And that's what certainly the Soviets said at the time. I remember Valentin Falin, a Soviet foreign ministry official, and others condemned it. Said, Gorbachev, what are you doing? You're giving away the shop for no guarantees and no treaty, effectively. The question then becomes why? Why did the US feel it was in its interest to expand a military alliance which was created and designed to hold back the Soviet Union and, of course, effectively its successor state based in Moscow? Why is it necessary? And of course, this is a question which we ask about so many actions by this political West, by the militarized political West. Why does it need to start or to stir up conflict over Taiwan when Nancy Pelosi visited? Why does it need to feel that China is an enemy? The last thing the Chinese think is that they're an enemy of the United States. I'm going to Beijing shortly, it was just they're just an astonishment. And of course, in Europe as well. Who needs it? Well, the military-industrial complex needs it. It's perhaps this ethos, this vision. And can I just add one other thing? Is that it's this Commonwealth idea that the United States is doing this allegedly for human rights, for expansion of democracy, and all of that. So we have two types of politics fighting. The associated with the United Nations, that vision of global, it was not peace, but certainly managing conflict and hopefully ending it, is this idea of sovereign internationalism. States, there's now 200 in the world. Colonies have, the age of empires over. We've had decolonization. 200 odd states, 193 in the United Nations. Sovereign states now have matured. They demand to be respected. It's no longer a one-man show as it was in 1945, led by Washington and with Moscow obviously devastated after the war. And so I don't think Washington and the leaders really have caught up with it, but it's all couched in this language of democratic internationalism, not sovereign internationalism, a totally different way of doing it. It's democratism is the relationship of democratism to democracy is what dogmatic Marxism-Leninism is to socialism. In other words, it's false.
More sleight of hand. That brings me to another thing that has been a disagreement in some of the progressive community, and that is the relationship between the expansion of NATO and what's happened in Ukraine. Back in the day, there were many people who advised against expanding NATO, and that certainly included Gorbachev, but also William Burns, who was a political counselor to the US Embassy in Moscow, later even head of the CIA, George Kennan, who was a former ambassador to both the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and Secretary of Defense William Perry, who wrote a book about this, which I read, and many other statespeople who opposed the expansion of NATO. But what we're up against are people who claim that the expansion of NATO had nothing to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I'd like you to elaborate on that. And then I'm going to put a little other thing with that question. And that is something I had never heard of before I read your book. And that was the US Committee to Expand NATO. I didn't know such a committee existed. And that it was headed by Bruce Jackson, who was the director of strategic planning for Lockheed. I mean, this obvious conflict of interest is just mind-boggling. And so I want you to talk both about that committee, which I had never heard of before, how long it lasted, what it has done, who was on it, and what the impact of the NATO expansion has been on the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. In addition to that list you've just mentioned of those US statespeople who have opposed it, I'll add one person more, and that is Zbigniew Brzezinski, the famous advisor to Jimmy Carter and really, anti-Soviet to his fingertips, a Pole. And in his famous book of 1997, The Grand Chessboard, he actually was obviously a passionate advocate for NATO enlargement, but even he said we have to have an overarching security framework with Russia, with Moscow. So it wasn't even NATO enlargement in and of itself; it was the way it was done. because NATO maybe there's a good argument for NATO, and I've made this argument myself that it stops Turkey going to war with Greece. Basically it sort of damping down what it was in the 1930s, small European states, bashing each other as they have been doing for the last 2,000 years. So, there's an argument for it, but you cannot, and you had to bring Moscow into it somehow or other, substantively, not just decoratively, not just like the 1997 treaty and the NATO Partnership Council. So and they didn't. Another of your great scholars is William Hill. He did a marvelous book called No Place for Russia. And he gives chapter and verse on how Russia. So the bottom line to your question, was NATO largely responsible for the war in Ukraine? Yes, 100%, but it is garlanded with all sorts of other identity issue and it's overlain with all sorts of other elements. But it was a security dilemma at its very heart. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, admitted as much a couple of months ago. A great speech, and he says, of course it was NATO, and all of those who say it was not is wrong. And those Ukrainians in particular who deny it are in many ways, and I take a very hard line, are responsible for the catastrophe. Obviously, it lies with Putin and the decision to invade. That goes without saying. But, what are the conditions which created a view in Moscow that something had to be done? And of course, as the CIA was setting up these bases in Ukraine and all of that stuff. But the bottom line is, it was a security dilemma. And of course, once the Biden administration came in, and you've got people like Jake Sullivan, who is deeply embedded in the false Russiagate allegations, and you've got Blinken and you've got Biden, who are all inept in terms of diplomacy, then we were heading for a catastrophe. As for the Committee for NATO Enlargement, Bruce Jackson, they were super active, taking into account the whole think tank world, the Atlantic Council, of course, the branch of NATO think tank, a whole stack of others, and indeed, as you alluded to, a whole stack of people from the military-industrial complex. And of course, he was very active in Europe. So he was very closely involved with those in Eastern Europe, those who really wanted to join NATO, because they wanted to join NATO because, in a sense, given the option of choices, that was the only thing on the table. And if I was in Poland or Warsaw, I would have probably thought the same, even though I'd have taken into account that it's a highly dangerous game. So Bruce Jackson was desperately, his whole activity was, in my view, pernicious. And of course, they would manipulate public consciousness. As you know, in the United States, there is, and in fact, in the United Kingdom as well, a very tight sort of informational ecosystem. And it's very hard to break through, exceptionally hard, and harder today in some ways than it was in the first Cold War, when there were still, there used to be big socialist movements in Western Europe. You had, and of course, organizations like your own are, magnificently putting things into the public domain. But today, but we were overwhelmed. Those are questioning NATO enlargement by those committees of the sort like Bruce Jackson. There's the German Marshall Fund. So there was a whole vast network calling for NATO enlargement. And those of us peaceniks who warned, and the list you've mentioned, George Kennan and so many more, they were just simply battered and they went ahead like a steamroller. Even leaders like Merkel and France were reluctant at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008 to promise NATO enlargement to Ukraine for those exact reasons, that it would lead to conflict, which it did in the end, of course.
So during the Cold War, there was this delicate balance of power between NATO countries, Warsaw Pact countries, and the non-aligned countries. But only NATO, of course, continues to exist. But what I find very interesting right now is the non-aligned movement may be picking up steam again. So I wanted to ask you about that. You wrote about a multipolar collaborative world that is emerging as a juxtaposition to the neoliberal hegemonic strategy that is focused on US as the lone superpower. So which countries do you think are laying a groundwork for a multipolar alliance? Where does the global South fit into this? And how would this movement affect or impact US power going forward? Where do you see the next few years going with a kind of maybe a multipolar alliance, the non-aligned movement, something like that that existed prior to current times?
We're witnessing, every 30 odd years or so, the world resets. We saw it in 1945. We saw it in 1989 with the end of the Cold War, end of the Soviet Union, and we're witnessing it today. So there's a major, the tectonic shifts. But this change taking place now is absolutely epical. It's hopefully going to take place without a world war, because usually at the end of a world war, we start again, as it were. Uh, it's absolutely epical. This is what Xi Jinping, the president of China, said when he visited Moscow. Well, it was actually, I was going to say earlier, last year, that we're witnessing changes that only happen about once in a century. And what we're witnessing today is the disintegration of the political West. It's already lost its morality in, or starting so many wars all over the place. I'm thinking of the bombing of Serbia in 1999, the destruction of the Libyan state in 2011, the illegal invasion, the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq, and so on and so forth. What is happening is against the political West, but behaving in a different way. We're seeing the emergence of a political East. Now, this political East is made up of many different components, but it's, certainly in its vocalization, it is saying we've got to go back to the United Nations principles of sovereign internationalism, respect for the sovereignty of states, but committed to multilateral dealing with global climate change, with all those other issues which face humanity. So this political East is, I think, a convenient way of suggesting that there is this, as you say, this huge groundswell, and the West is becoming more and more marginalized. It's desperately trying to bring, India and other countries on board. This political East is made up of many components. The non-aligned movement is definitely back. We see it uh, in Indonesia, of course, where the initial Bandung conference took place in 1955. Brazil, of course. Just look how active Brazil is. Last week, there was a meeting, or I think week before last, of the African Union, in which, for some reason, Lula, president of Brazil, was there and made a great speech. But the African Union, speech after speech, condemned the behavior of the political West. And the other component obviously is the Russo-Chinese alignment. It's not an alliance, but it's one of the most profound partnerships in the world today. There's also, the BRICS organization, BRICS Plus, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. 5 new countries joined in January. That's Egypt, Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Amazing constellation of forces. There's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization with 8 states, including India, China, and Russia. So the world is changing, and it's bypassing, and together their GDP is bigger than that of the G7. Europe, of course, has wounded itself so grievously by failing to develop its own identity. That's the other thing, by the way, of Gorbachev, is that his vision of a common European home was to say, look, Atlanticism worked very well. Maybe it was needed in the first Cold War, but it's over. That's exactly what Eisenhower said. If you remember when NATO was established, he said, if US forces are still in Europe 10 years from now, then we will have failed. He obviously wasn't leader in 1949, but that was his comment. And of course, 70, 80 years later, US forces are still here. What we needed all the way through was a genuine pan-continental vision of unity, European unity, not against the United States, of course not, in partnership with the US, but in partnership with everyone else as well. And that itself would have helped change the United States from being this huge militaristic tiger, almost uncontrollable, to a genuine Commonwealth, providing what we do. We expect and want US leadership, but of a better sort, the sort that Kennedy was reaching towards before he died.
Great. I know we're running out of time for my questions and I still have a whole bunch more, but maybe I would like you to do something. This could take a lot of time, but I'm going to ask you to see if we can make it shorter. Because
Yep.
I'd like you to go through a little bit of a list of what has happened in Ukraine since 2004. We don't have to go back before that, but with the Orange Revolution, then the election later of Yanukovych, the coup that removed him from power in 2014, which then resulted in Russia's intervention in Crimea. So to kind of go through some of the history since 2004 briefly to show the connections, because what we're not getting in our media are the connections between these various things. It's like they all were separate things. They're not connected. There's nothing to learn from the one that happened 10 years ago, or what the US role was and has been in Ukraine, at least since 2014, and certainly probably earlier. So if you could just give us a little bit of that history briefly, how they connect up to the war that we're in today.
Yeah, I'm cognizant. You said keep it short, keep it brief. But I was then going to say very briefly, we have to go back almost to 1991
I know.
because right from the beginning, the United States has been obsessed by not allowing Russia and Ukraine to establish a genuine partnership and community. Of course, in the 1990s, it was rather different. But Brzezinski, the chap we mentioned earlier, he actually said, if Russia and Ukraine get together, then they will, they will be talking about a major power. So we've got to do absolutely everything to stop it, which means poisoning the relationship. Well, they've done a great job at that. And at some stages, the US Embassy in Kiev, you could almost say it was like a pro-consular office. And of course, Biden, when he was vice president, he visited Ukraine 8 times. So it's a long history. But slightly, I mean, you say these events, you're absolutely right. You have to see the connection from all the way through, above all, the overthrow of the legally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, after the false flag sniper killings of the Maidan activists. But the big picture, and that what gives unity to the whole time, is what sort of vision of Ukraine we wanted. Now, what happened is the United States and the West has always supported what I call the monist vision. That is the ethno-nationalist vision. This is a vision that Ukraine for Ukrainians, as it were, by that ethnic, we're talking about ethnic, and a very narrow vision of what the Ukrainian state should look like. On the other side, we have those like me who've been arguing for a more pluralistic vision. That's multicultural, multilingual, with Russian, of course, was almost every Ukrainian, apart from those in extreme West, spoke and speak Russian. Even Zelensky, of course, was a native Russian speaker. He spent a lot of time in Moscow. We also spent some time in Mongolia, which is another interesting story. So, that's the bottom line. This continuity, which you allude to, is about who will shape the destiny and what sort of Ukrainian state would emerge. I've always argued the only way, and obviously we all want a democratic, sovereign, the whole Ukrainian state, always wanted it, but warned that that ethno-nationalist vision, above all based in Galicia, also reaching back to that sort of fascistic tradition of Bandera. Remember what happened in the Canadian Parliament a few weeks ago when they gave a standing ovation from the former SS officer with huge enthusiasm. That, in other words, why has the political West been supporting a vision of Ukrainian statehood that would inevitably engender conflict, would also poison relations with Moscow, destroy the ability of Ukraine to come together as a modern, democratic, inclusive nation state? We want it in the US, we want it in the UK. Why couldn't Ukraine do it as well? So, that's that continuity in all the political incidents to which you mentioned. Of course, in a sense, is about the war on Donbass is all about that. It's all about who speaks for Ukraine. The people in Donbass have agency. I've met many and spoken to many, and they say, why don't you listen to us? In Crimea, they said, why don't you listen to us? And of course, it wasn't in the political West's interest. The United States, obviously, the military people, wanted to take over the Sevastopol naval base. That was where it was heading. That's where, imagine if an external power was going to come in and take whatever, I was going to say Norfolk, Virginia, or whatever. It's just crazy, crazy stuff. But the West could not put itself, the political West, that is, in the shoes of anybody sitting in Moscow. It's not Putin. You put in Schmutin or Tutin or whoever. They will behave. And in fact, they would have probably behaved much worse, to be honest. I mean, it's so bad. The situation is so bad that Putin emerges. Obviously, it's dreadful, the whole situation, how it has turned out. But, there's a logic, as you say, and to empathy, meaning understanding the position of the other, is the foundation for effective diplomacy. And Washington has not been able to do this.
No, it seems that they're not interested because it doesn't feed our war machine.
Indeed.
But one last little question I want to ask before I open it up, and that is the Minsk II agreements that was promised but never followed through. And do you think that promise was made falsely? And why wasn't it followed through? Because it seemed like with that, this war could have been prevented.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for raising the Minsk one. I'm working on a paper now. It's called the Minsk Syndrome. And that is precisely this. The Minsk II agreement was February 2015, and it was a way of putting an end to the war in the Donbass. But more than that, it was a way of reshaping the Ukrainian state, not in a bad way. If we have in Spain, it's a unitary state, but you have Catalonia has a lot of, and we in the UK, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, have devolved administrations. Why on earth couldn't Ukraine do it? That was a promise of Minsk. But the Minsk Syndrome was never signed in good faith by the Western partners. And the Minsk Syndrome is why Moscow cannot trust the West. And of course, Angela Merkel, the former leader of Germany, Francois Hollande, head of France, who signed at the time, who supported at the time, both said, well, we never planned to implement it. It was a way of buying time to arm Ukraine, to make it a bastion against Russia. So if you were sitting in Moscow, you'd be looking at this and say, hang on, guys, what are you doing? You may have seen the New York Times last week, a few days ago, in which they're talking about the 12 CIA bases within Ukraine on a border, plus a big main base, which has gone up from 80 to 800 personnel. They are monitoring every move. They actually could listen to their telephone calls within the Kremlin. And they were using it to try to assassinate Putin personally, by the way, when a car smashed into his car on the Moscow ring. He wasn't in the car at the time. But we're talking about, on the border of Russia, a constant probing and pushing and very aggressive. This is before 2022. So it was so, you sometimes think the political West and the Washington class has lost leave of its senses. It's got absolutely no limits, which they did have in the first Cold War. This was why this second Cold War is more dangerous, more amorphous, but no less deep, in fact, much deeper than the first. And it's going much harder to end, much, much harder.
Okay, thank you for this. I am going to, even though I have more questions, I'm going to control myself and open it up for other people to ask questions. When I call on you, you can unmute. Otherwise, please stay muted. So I will be looking for people. Usually it takes a little bit of time before people put their hands up. Okay, Jeffrey, I see you. You want to unmute? You need to unmute, Jeffrey. For some reason, he's not able.
Okay.
Oh, there you
No,
go.
yeah, I got it. I had well, the first question I have you actually pretty much answered, which was my impression was always that Angela Merkel was acting in good faith during the Minsk discussions, and I was kind of surprised in the book to hear you say that no, they were basically using those discussions as a delaying tactic in order to strengthen, to give Ukraine time to build up its defenses with the aid of the CIA and the US. So just to confirming that really was the situation with Angela Merkel, I'm kind of very disappointed to hear that at one level. I have a couple more questions related to the whole peace movement. One is the role of Boris Johnson in a number of podcasts or commentaries. I've heard that Boris Johnson went to Ukraine, talked to Zelensky with the approval or encouragement of Biden and his entourage, in order to convince Zelensky to go. I mean, Boris put on his Churchillian persona, went in there and told Zelensky to go the full hog against the Russians. Do you have any kind of information or commentary on that? The third thing I want to ask, sorry to get a bit long-winded here.
Why don't you ask that after he answers this question?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Yep. So you're right. So as you say about Angela Merkel, very disappointing, and Francois Hollande, and it shows a bad faith, and it's going to create a pitch for any future peace settlement, because how can you trust the West if it's already the sense of betrayal over NATO enlargement in the first instance, and now secondly the Minsk one. So it's going to be really tough. As for Boris Johnson, yes, we had a peace deal. We know that there was a document. The talks began 2 days after the war began. The Russia invaded on the 24th of February 2022. On the 26th, there was the first meeting in Gomel in Belarus, and I won't go through all the details. But by the last days of March, that is just over a month after the beginning of the war, there was a peace deal, and it was going to be precisely about this NATO business. Ukraine would be neutral. It would be demilitarized, and what that means obviously was going to have to be negotiated, but it wouldn't be able to act like a sort of a bastion against Russia militarily. It was all there. And of course, we're talking about not just Western people saying it was there. We're talking about the leader of Israel at the time, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. We're talking about Gerhard Schröder said it. And we're talking about the Turkish leadership, because the discussions then went to Istanbul. And they had a deal. And, it's got a 13-point deal and all the rest. However, Boris Johnson came in on the 9th of April at this time, and he said to Zelensky, and this isn't because of the Bucha massacre, because even after that, Zelensky says, look, we have to continue with these talks. Boris Johnson flew in, uninvited. He telephoned earlier. The West was not supporting this peace deal. So the NATO powers also met on the 24th of March. So there was all sorts of things going on, but Boris Johnson conclusively flew in and says, you cannot, it's up to you to make a deal. But first, you can't deal with Putin. He's a war criminal. Second, you may make a deal, but we're not going to provide any security guarantees. But the basic line was, you go to war, but we will then supply the weapons and all the material and so on. So Zelensky, foolishly, yet again foolishly, has been making catastrophic decisions all the way. He decided to go along with Boris Johnson, whom we all know as a buffoon, a blusterer, and a man you wouldn't trust with a 4-shilling piece. So, absolutely, this guy who's just crazy. I mean, he's but he then, as you say, his sub-Churchillian moment, and it was a catastrophe. The result is a peace deal on offer then would have given Ukraine favorable terms, much better than they're likely to get anytime soon. Now, with the loss of, we don't know how many, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian boys and men and women, it's just catastrophic, absolutely pointless. The point is, this is, and I must say this, not to take away the tragedy and the losses, it was one of the most pointless, unnecessary, and avoidable wars in history. It was avoidable, but the political West was intent on humiliating Russia to undermine Russian power, and Ukraine was the battering ram which they decided to use. That was a cynical calculation of Boris Johnson, and of course he went there with the approval of Washington.
Zelensky should have stayed an actor.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Jeffrey, you had another part to that question, so I'll go back to you.
Well, the other part to that question was partly answered because I was a little confused and thought that this third part of my question, which was about the Istanbul Peace Conference, was apart from the whole episode with Boris Johnson, but it was part of the same whole deal. It was part of the same episode. And where I heard this was I was listening to an interview with, I don't know his name, and if I knew it, I wouldn't be able to pronounce it. But he was a former spokesperson for Zelensky, who eventually was exiled, went himself exiled in the United States because he had some kind of problem in Ukraine. But he was one of the main negotiators in that Istanbul conference. Now, he thought that the Bucha, which you have just kind of negated that, he thought that the Bucha episode was one of the reasons why Zelensky pulled out of that conference.
Yeah, you have in mind Alexei Orestovich. He was very close to Zelensky at that time. Certainly, Bucha was there in the background, and Irpin and the other terrible things which happened. So yes, that was there. Alexei Orestovich has now changed his tune. He's now, as you say, in exile, and he is making a lot of devastating critique of Zelensky's leadership, the mistakes, the sacrifices that Ukraine has made pointlessly. I don't take for a second anything away from the courage of the Ukrainian soldiers defending their land, and I understand it. Of course, I understand it. But you know, but Alexei Orestovich has been making the argument now, which is the one I made earlier, that what it still hinges upon is what sort of Ukraine are we talking about? Not one which is de-Russifying, destroying that element of Ukrainian identity which is Russophone. It's like in the United States. If you were suddenly to decide that Spanish language is illegal, no newspapers or televisions can speak Spanish, it would just be absurd. This is what has happened in Ukraine. Can you believe it? And why is the West supporting something in Ukraine that it wouldn't dream of supporting in its own country? So, and Orestovich is making this point. So he's the one saying it now, that we needed a pluralistic Ukraine. He didn't say it at the time, and he should have done. And then when he's asked, why didn't you say it at the time? Well, he says, the circumstances were different. Fair enough. It's, we all rejoice when a sinner repents.
Linda, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, these are kind of bigger scope questions, but from your point of view, since you've studied it so closely, if we had not done what we did, and messed things up with NATO and Russia, do you feel that things wouldn't have exploded in this way? I mean, in other words, if we had kind of played into letting Russia, I guess, come into NATO in some way, what would have unfolded from your perspective?
Thank you. That's going to the deeper, as you say, the deeper issue. The thing is that, and thanks for that. The thing is that there is absolutely no real substantive reason for Russo-US relations to be so bad. You don't have a border conflict. You don't have any historical. In fact, Russia and don't forget, Russia supported the Union side in your civil war. So it was, the British were supporting the Confederacy, as you know. So it was, and, going all the way through in the First World War, Second World War, it was on the same side. So, and don't forget the first Iraq War, the Soviet Union was basically supportive of, getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. So it was the United States and Washington leadership, it was an act of genius to turn a country which was so pro-American, so, so enthralled by the American way of life, and indeed its political achievements, which are substantive and important. Of course they are. And to have turned a country which was so wanting to become part of this political West, part of this better West, and to have turned it into such an enemy, and with such contempt for America today, contempt for everything. And of course, if you're sitting in Moscow, they will do everything to thwart the United States today. And of course, it could lead to even be to nuclear destruction of us all. So how the Washington leadership, with the dreadful and shameful acquiescence of London and the European capitals, has allowed this to develop because it was so unnecessary. Gorbachev kept saying this, and Yeltsin and Putin, when in his first years, that they wanted to be part of the better West. They didn't want, and they were not allowed to join the political West, and so we're today. So it was so avoidable. And by the way, the sort of discussion we're having today, and this is why I wrote this book, if my analysis has got any validity, if the beginning to find solutions to crises or issues is accurate and effective analysis. I hope that I can perhaps contribute to that discussion and to say how we can get out of it by analyzing just how bad the situation is. I know I'm not saying that it's just Washington. Of course, it takes two to tango, and in Moscow, the democratic so-called backsliding and the difficulties and the repression, I condemn it. Of course I do, and I'd obviously, but countries have to find their own destiny. It's not for us to say how and when and where. That applies to India, it applies to China. China, in its own way, of course, we can criticize it, but if we were diplomats, you deal with a state as it is, and the more pressure you put on a state, of course, the worse things get quite often. I keep insisting that it has to be on the basis of the UN Charter and the fundamental principles of the United Nations, which I think we could all agree it's about a common human position of humanity.
That was my next question. What do you think is in store next with respect to US-China relations?
It's bad, and it's going to get badder. Unless something strange goes on in Washington. We saw the first Trump administration that he was when he started pouring in weapons into Ukraine. He was the one who in 2018 started sanctions and so on against China and changed the whole narrative. So Washington, as you say, it was Biden, Schmeiden, or Tiden, or Trump, Pump, or whatever. It's this military industrial complex, this political West, is a machine out of control. Worse, it's now damaging itself. We in Europe has more or less committed suicide economically in recent years. Washington is doing okay. I mean, US is doing more or less okay, but how is it doing okay? Massive social inequality, injustice, etc., etc. Isn't it? And infrastructure is so exhausted. You go to the United States, you think, hang on, this is meant to be the world's great power. Why is everything looking so tired? Why is this bridge collapsing? Why is there no metro system, etc., etc.? And why is this road pothole, etc.? Why is there so much poverty? Why is the schools so underfunded? The list is endless. And why are you spending trillions on a military industrial complex which is out there to kill people? Let's move to a Commonwealth of the United States. Let's move to a Commonwealth of the West based on UN principles. Live and let live. We'll have our views on Moscow and on South Africa, whatever you like, but we have to go. But unfortunately, I don't anticipate any change for the better in the US, obviously, as the global leader. And of course, the European leaders have proven themselves to be absolutely incapable of independent decision. The European Union, which I used to believe was a peace project, it's now turned out to be totally militarized. That leader today, head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has betrayed every single fundamental principle on which the European Union was founded. It almost makes me glad that the United Kingdom is out of the European Union now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question? Otherwise, I wanted to, just before we end, there are a couple of things I'd like to bring up with you. One is something that you mentioned in the book that I hadn't ever thought of, the amount of sanctions that the US had been imposing on other parts of the world, but you wrote that over 1/3 of the world's population has been subjected to US sanctions. This is a staggering number, especially as we know sanctions mostly target civilians. I'm very concerned about that and the financial sanctions that were put on Russia early on. Maybe you can tell us when those sanctions happened. I know they were dismissed from the Swiss system of payments between banks. And I don't think most people even know that the US was responsible for that or that it even has happened. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah, thanks. Sanctions is it's meant to be an alternative to war, but what it's become now is an instrument of economic statecraft as a supplement to war. The modern age of sanctions began with the Magnitsky Act of December 2012. You remember that there used to be this thing called Jackson-Vanik Amendment against the Soviet Union, and it was still in operation all the way through until 2012, can you believe it, given that most favored nation stuff. So that was a sanction. Russia, the United States, has never stopped sanctioning the Soviet Union and Russia since its establishment in 1917, 1918. So it hasn't stopped. And so if you were sitting in Moscow, you'd be a bit miffed about this. And of course, it began, and then we had the events of 2014. And so today, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. The US and its allies have now imposed 25,000 sanctions on Russia. The European Union is just had its 13th package. You couldn't make it up. More than that, and you alluded to it. So Russia has some of the sanctions on Russia, and I've spoken to many people there. In fact, we did a big program in London yesterday on this. And they're saying that sanctions are the best thing that's happened to Russia because it has taught it not to be dependent on the West, to separate from the West. And that's where the epochal change. 500 years ago, well, Peter the Great in the early 18th century turned the window to Europe to move to the West. That window is now closing. And Russia is turning east and south and north. It has nothing but contempt for the West. Meanwhile, the West itself is destroying itself. Its financial credibility is being undermined. Who is going to put money in the United States? I mean, obviously, your debt is funded by people buying US Treasury bonds. They're not going to do that in the future. China has already taken out $1 trillion. You know, it's almost, you can say, it's a suicidal behavior. US sanctions somebody else, so everybody's going to be alarmed. The SWIFT system, indeed. Also, if they actually confiscate the nearly $300 billion that Russia had put in Western banks, Western depositories, then that really will be a death blow to the credibility of the Western financial system. So sanctions is a fundamental issue of our time.
Okay, and I'm going to end with a last comment, and I'd like to get your comment on this, because you wrote about the great powers had an opportunity after the end of the First Cold War to ensure that peace and development took priority over conflict and hierarchy. That seeing the end of the Cold War in terms of communism versus capitalism, winners versus losers, is a form of defeat in itself. And it shows a total lack of imagination and understanding of what could happen. And this is, of course, still the prevailing narrative. Do you think there are any people in leadership in the US, Europe, or the UK who have the type of vision that could get us past these polarizing and easily to manipulate people type of scenarios?
Yeah, I immediately think names. In the United States, there is now a growing movement of, can I put it, old-fashioned conservatives. We're talking about more the old-fashioned, not America firsters. No, we're talking about that tradition in the 19th century into the 20th of a conservative internationalism, which is, I call it sovereign internationalism. And I think we've got, for example, in the United States, this Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And I've been reading lately, and it's not something in the past which I'd ever admitted or even confessed, even I'm a Catholic, to do. And that is the American Conservative, the journal, the online journal, which is actually precisely advancing that argument of traditional American conservative internationalism. yes, it's a powerful state. We expect leadership from the United States, but good leadership, to help solve problems, not create them. So yes, there are people out there. In the UK, no one, hardly anybody. In Europe, we have lost our conscience, we've lost our mind, and very few people. There's Claire Daly, in the Irish member of European Parliament, but we can count these people on the fingers of one hand, basically.
That's kind of disturbing, isn't it? But then it's like the only people who can rise to the top in this system are people who support that way of thinking. And that's what needs to be broken. Do you have any last words you want to say before we end the program today?
Well, all I can say is my admiration for you people for getting together, and it really does inspire and cheer me to have sessions like this where we have people who are, openly discussing. But we may not agree on every point, of course. I don't expect that, but we're doing what we should be doing, which is open dialogue. And there's not, unfortunately, I get a lot of flack, and I'm sure you guys do as well. But I just therefore wish you success and courage in these terribly dark times, terribly dark times.
Yes, indeed. And I want to tell everybody before we stop the recording, again, The Lost Peace, a brilliant book. And to really understand this and get into the details that an hour conversation can't quite get into, I highly recommend that book. It's really phenomenal. So I want to thank you, Richard, for being with us today. I will follow up with you and send you a recording of this on our YouTube channel tonight. So you will have it and you can do whatever you want with it. Everyone else on the call and other people who registered will also get the video. At the moment, I'm going to stop recording.